In the untamed West, a wounded Apache widow and a solitary rancher cross paths in a storm that changes everything. Trust is rare, danger is everywhere, and one simple promise could rewrite both their lives. Join this powerful Wild West journey, where fear meets hope, and hearts learn to heal. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow the story. Let's get started. The desert evening stretched wide and silent across the New Mexico territory as Thomas Hale guided his horse toward the northern edge of his ranch. The sun was sinking behind the mesas, casting long shadows across the scrubland. That was when he first noticed the figure, still, solitary and half-hidden by a cluster of junipers. At first, he thought it was a trespasser or a traveler needing directions, but when he rode closer, he saw the truth. She was an Apache woman, alone, weary, and carrying an air of sorrow that seemed heavier than the sky itself. Thomas dismounted slowly, careful not to alarm her. Life in the West had taught him that fear made people dangerous, and he sensed she had plenty of fear buried behind her stern, guarded eyes. Her clothes were worn, her braided hair dusted by the wind, and a single leather pouch hung at her side. She looked as though she had walked many miles, not out of choice but necessity. Thomas felt the familiar tug of responsibility that came naturally to men who lived far from towns, where helping a stranger often meant saving a life. He offered her water first. That was always the safest gesture, simple, universal, unthreatening. She accepted, though her movements were cautious, as if she expected the offer to be a trap. As she drank, he noticed the bruises on her wrists, faint but unmistakable, and the way she kept glancing behind her like someone accustomed to being hunted. Thomas didn't ask questions, though a dozen of them pressed against his tongue. Out here, a person's silence was often the only protection they had left. For the next few days, she stayed near the edge of his land, never crossing into his home space, never asking for more than water and a place to rest. Thomas respected that distance. He didn't push her, didn't flood her with questions, didn't pretend to understand her pain. He simply let her be. He fixed fences. She watched. He saddled horses. She stayed under the shade of the old cottonwood tree. They were two souls sharing the same land, but living in separate worlds built from different histories and wounds. Her name, Naya, came only after 3 days of silence. She spoke it softly, not as a greeting but as a warning, like she expected him to misuse it. Thomas repeated it with care, as if speaking it too harshly might shatter something delicate. He noticed the way her eyes softened at his tone, only slightly, but enough to hint that she was finally starting to believe he wasn't a danger. Even then, she kept her distance, perched on the edge of every moment like a bird ready to flee at the first wrong move. The settlers in town often told stories about Apache widows, stories twisted by fear, ignorance, and prejudice. Thomas, however, had learned long ago not to trust local gossip. He saw things for what they were. A woman abandoned by fate, trying desperately to survive in a world that had taken nearly everything from her. He didn't need to know the details to understand her exhaustion. Grief had a language of its own, spoken through silence, guarded posture, and eyes that had seen too much. One evening, the sky bled orange and violet as the sun slid behind the cliffs. Thomas approached Naya with a bowl of stew, still steaming from the fire. She stared at it for a long moment before accepting it, though her hand trembled slightly. He could feel the weight of her hesitance, the tension in the moment, the silent battle she fought between hunger and caution. When she finally tasted the food, her shoulders loosened just a fraction, as if warmth had returned to places that had been cold for too long. Then her voice broke the quiet, sharp and sudden. "Rancher, do you just want something from me, like everyone else?" The question cut through him more deeply than he expected. It wasn't anger behind her words, it was pain, old and familiar, worn into her spirit like a scar that refused to heal. Thomas realized instantly that she wasn't accusing him personally. She was confronting the ghosts of every man who had treated her kindness as a currency. She was asking whether he, too, saw her as something to take rather than someone to help. He took off his hat, letting the desert breeze cool the sweat on his forehead as he searched for the right words. In that moment, he understood that anything he said would matter more than he realized. She wasn't just asking out of suspicion. She was asking out of survival. "No, ma'am," he said quietly, his voice steady and free of the false sweetness she had heard from others. "I just want to make sure you're safe. That's all." It wasn't a declaration or a promise, just a simple truth spoken plainly, the way Thomas said everything that mattered. But Naya didn't soften immediately. She stood rigid, her eyes fixed on him with a mixture of disbelief and wary hope. She had heard too many promises before, promises from soldiers who claimed they would protect her people, traders who claimed they would pay fairly, and white men who claimed compassion, only to reveal cruelty. Trust, for her, was not something earned in one sentence, no matter how gentle. She turned her face away, staring toward the distant hills, as if the land itself could tell her whether the rancher spoke truth or lies. Thomas didn't push. He simply nodded and stepped back, giving her the space she needed. He understood that trust was like water in the desert, precious, slow to appear, and easily spoiled. As he walked back toward the barn, he felt the weight of her question lingering in the air between them. He realized that helping her would take patience, consistency, and respect, things many men never bothered to offer. But Thomas Hale had weathered storms harsher than mistrust. If Naya needed time, he would give it to her. If she needed distance, he would honor it. That night, as the desert wind whispered across the plains and coyotes howled from the hills, Thomas sat by his fire, thinking about the woman who remained just beyond the glow of the flames. She didn't believe him yet, but for the first time since she arrived, she hadn't walked away. That small choice, fragile as it was, felt like the beginning of something deeper than either of them understood. In a land where survival often depended on strangers, one question had opened a door neither of them expected, not to danger, but to the possibility of trust. Days passed slowly, like the desert sun dragging itself across the sky. Naya remained close enough to Thomas's ranch to accept water and shelter, yet far enough to guard the fragile boundary she believed kept her safe. She moved with a quiet caution, studying the land, the sky, and the rancher himself, as though she expected danger to rise from any corner. Thomas didn't try to force conversation or ask for explanations. He simply worked, mending fences, checking cattle, repairing the windmill, glancing occasionally toward her, making sure she had the space she clearly believed she needed. Naya spent much of her time near the cottonwood tree, its leaves rustling softly above her like protective whispers. She watched Thomas with sharp, observant eyes, noticing how he approached his tasks without swagger or ego. He didn't boast, didn't show off, didn't treat her like a curiosity. That alone set him apart from most men she had encountered since her world had shattered. Still, years of loss and betrayal had carved fear deep into her bones. She didn't know how to trust the peace he offered, not yet. Every kind gesture stirred an ache inside her, as though she feared it was only a prelude to something cruel. When Thomas brought her food, he placed it on a nearby rock and stepped back without a word. When he built a small shelter for her horse, he didn't announce it or ask for gratitude. He simply saw what needed doing and did it. Naya had known men who used kindness as bait, who hid cruel intentions behind gentle tones. Every softness she saw in Thomas seemed too good, too clean, too unlike the world she knew. One evening, as the sky darkened, a strange pressure settled over the land. The wind shifted direction, the air crackled, even the horses grew restless. Naya sensed a storm coming, the kind the desert unleashed with sudden fury. but she underestimated its strength. Lightning ripped across the horizon like white fire, and thunder rolled so violently that the earth itself seemed to tremble. Her horse reared in panic, jerking against the reins, eyes wide with fear. Before she could calm him, the storm descended in full force. Rain exploded from the sky in brutal sheets. Wind hurled dust and debris in every direction. Naya stumbled backward as a broken branch tore free from a nearby tree, whipping dangerously close to her. Suddenly, strong arms caught her shoulders, pulling her safely aside. Thomas appeared from the darkness, drenched, breathless, yet steady. Without hesitation, he grabbed the reins of her terrified horse and pressed his body between her and the violent wind, as if shielding her was instinct, not choice. For a brief moment, illuminated by lightning, their eyes met. It was not the glance of strangers or people separated by culture and history, but the connection of two bruised spirits who understood hardship all too well. The storm roared around them, but in that sliver of time they stood anchored together, united by something deeper than protection: recognition. Then the moment passed, replaced by frantic motion as Thomas led her struggling horse toward shelter, urging both of them to safety. Inside the small barn, the wind howled against the walls, shaking the wooden beams. Naya stood trembling, soaked, her breath uneven. She watched Thomas tie the horse securely, his movements calm despite the roaring storm outside. He brushed wet hair from his face and glanced toward her, concern plain in his eyes. The only light came from a single lantern, flickering weakly against the darkness. Something inside Naya cracked open under that warm glow. Not trust, not yet, but the first fragile fracture in her walls. When the storm finally weakened, the world outside became eerily quiet, as though the desert were pausing to breathe again. Naya's voice rose softly, barely audible over the dripping roof. Men have taken from me my home, my people, my husband. I fear you'll do the same. Her words weren't an accusation. They were a confession, pulled from a place so deep it almost hurt her to voice it. She didn't look at Thomas as she spoke. Instead, she stared at the ground, her hands clenched, bracing for disappointment or misunderstanding. Thomas stepped closer, but stayed careful not to cross the invisible line she still held between them. His voice was low, steady, and softer than she expected. "Naya, I don't want anything from you." The sincerity in his tone wrapped around the words like a promise. "Not your land, not your loyalty, just the chance to prove I'm not like them." He didn't swear that he'd protect her or pretend he could fix her past. He offered something simpler, humbler, room for her to decide if he was worthy of trust. Naya lifted her gaze slowly, studying him as though searching for cracks in his calm exterior. The storm had drenched him completely, and water ran down his face, but his eyes remained clear. They held no greed, no hidden motive, no hunger disguised as kindness, only patience, and a quiet pain of his own, something he didn't speak of, but carried with him like a man who had also lost pieces of his life along the way. For the first time since she had met him, Naya felt the faint stir of belief. She didn't answer right away. Her silence wasn't rejection, it was consideration, something she had not given any man in a long time. The barn smelled of wet earth and warm horses. Outside, thunder rumbled one last time, distant now, as though the storm were retreating from the land and from her heart. She wrapped her arms around herself, not from cold, but from the unfamiliar vulnerability creeping in. Finally, she whispered, "I do not know how to trust anymore." It was a confession as fragile as cracked pottery. Thomas nodded gently, not expecting more. "Then I'll wait," he replied, "for as long as it takes." He didn't step closer, didn't reach for her, didn't try to fill the space with promises. He simply allowed the silence to return, this time different, less heavy, more open. Naya felt it too, the subtle shift in the air between them. She knew trust wouldn't grow overnight, but she also knew one thing with sudden clarity. Thomas Hale had not lied to her. Not tonight. Not once. As the rain softened into a steady whisper, Naya walked toward the barn door. She paused before stepping out, glancing back at Thomas with a small, hesitant nod. It wasn't acceptance, not fully, but it wasn't rejection either. It was permission. Permission for him to stand beside her in the story of her survival if he chose to stay. And he did. That night marked the beginning of a fragile understanding between them, one shaped not by need or debt, but by courage born from shared wounds.